Let me say one thing about the ninth week. We have the parable of what's usually called the parable of the prodigal son. Um, on your sheet, it has verses 11 through 14. We're going to have to extend that through verse 32. Otherwise, we still have the younger son out in the far country. If we stop at verse 14, and the only person that I know that would be happy about that would be the older brother.
The older brother.
But in order to get the whole story, and we're going to have to.
We should read the whole story.
We're going to have to go through 32, yeah. So if you'll remember that when you come to week 9. Today we're talking about the parable of the Great Banquet, and I want to read the parable, and then we'll talk about it. One of the dinner guests, on hearing this, now what he had heard was Jesus talking about inviting the lame, the crippled, the blind into a banquet. So it says, on hearing this, the dinner guest said to him, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Then Jesus said to him, "Someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is ready now.'" The reason, just to pause there, the reason that we've got 2 invitations is that this was the custom in the first century. If I invited you to dinner, I would let you know well ahead of time and give you an invitation. But I also would send somebody, or I would go myself and invite you on the day of the dinner. So we've had 2 invitations extended. But they all began to make excuses. They said to Jesus, or they said to him, "I have a piece of land and I must go out and see it. Please accept my regrets." Another said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I am going to try them out. Please accept my regrets." Another said, "I have just been married and therefore I cannot come." So the slave returned and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to his servant, "Go out into the shelters or out in the streets and lanes of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." And he said, and the servant said, "Sir, what you asked me to do has been done, and there is still room." Then the master said to the slave, "Go out into the woods and the lanes and come and compel them, or invite them, really is a better word. Invite them, please, to come in so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of these who were invited will taste my dinner." Let me spend just a moment in talking about the context of this, it's very interesting that the entire 14th chapter of Luke is filled with stories of people who are eating. In fact, somebody has labeled the 14th chapter of Luke as the chapter which should have the title, Come to the Table. Now, Luke does some very interesting things in putting subjects together. I remember when I used to teach preaching, I would talk about finding what is the center of the sermon. What is it that brings things together? Well, in the 15th chapter of Luke, as we're going to see, it is about losing things and finding them. The lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. So Luke is bringing together some very powerful things in his talking about various things relative to the kingdom. What holds the 14th chapter of Luke together then is that we are constantly coming to the table. The whole parable begins with Jesus being invited by a Pharisee to come to dinner. There is a man who is there, and the term in my Bible is the term dropsy, who had dropsy. You and I would call that today edema. It is, and I'm certainly not a doctor and don't play one on television, but it is where the capillaries leak and there is often swelling in different parts of the body. So this man had what in the first century they called dropsy, what you and I would call edema. Well, wouldn't you know it, the same problem we have run into throughout Luke's gospel, we run into in this story. What day has he come to be healed? He comes on the Jewish Sabbath. And the Jews considered the healing of somebody to be work. So Jesus begins at a meal by healing a person. Then we move into another story about coming to the table, where Jesus is saying, when you come to the table, don't take the seat of preference. Be humble enough just to sit in the back. And perhaps you may be asked to come to the front, but don't rush to take the seat of honor. So that part of Jesus' teaching is about humility. It's not about racing to the table so we can have a prominent place, but it is allowing people to take their places at the table. And Jesus said, since you're not rushing to take the place of prominence, just sit in the back. And maybe somewhere the person who is having the banquet or having the dinner may ask you to come to a place of prominence, but don't race there. One time when I was a pastor, we did an interesting thing with a group of people. We brought together some new members of our church, some longtime members of our church, and some who fell in between. And we drew 3 circles. And we said, now the inner circle, 3 concentric circles. The inner circle, we want you to point to that if you really feel that you are a part of the hospitality of this church and you really feel welcome, you point to the inner circle. Now, if you're uncertain about whether you feel welcome, and sometimes you do and sometimes you don't, then point to the second circle. If you feel completely left out of what is going on, that you're not involved in any way in the life of this church, and you would describe yourself not so much as being a strong member of the church, but more as an observer of what is going on, then put yourself in the outer circle. Now, it was interesting to see where people put themselves. Obviously, a lot of it had to do with the initiative that people took. But there also was a sense that some of the newer people felt more on the outside of the circle, or maybe on the second concentric circle, rather than on the inside. Now, what that did for us, the staff and I did this with a group of people, is it made us aware that as people came to our church, they were coming in different ways. Some were coming because they really felt this was their church. They were in the inner circle. They knew people, and so they felt very much a part of the church. Some said, no, we're in the second circle. We feel a part of the church, but we don't feel as much a part of the church as obviously those in the inner circle do. Now, what we were really concerned about were those who identified themselves on the outer concentric circle. Because what that said to us is that we had some people in the church who really didn't feel a part of things. Now, the reason that Jesus uses the table, the banquet, is because the table was the place where people usually came to discuss issues such as finances, social issues, or religious issues, which meant that when people were invited to the table, usually they were people from the same social circle. Because if I'm going to discuss, and you're going to discuss some religious issue or some social issue, it's usually done with people that you feel very close to. Now, there's no problem with that, except that if we have people, as we discovered in our church, that we had people who are outside on the outer concentric circle, then we wanted to know what we were going to have to do to help them to move at least to the second circle and hopefully to the inner circle. The banquet, the Great Banquet, is really the story, the parable that we're looking at today. Jesus, or the host, invites people that you would expect from the same social circle. But on the day that the banquet is being held, and when the servant goes to see them, they all have excuses. Now, these are not bad excuses, but they are excuses for not coming to the banquet. In fact, the third excuse is, I've just gotten married. And you'll find if you search through Deuteronomy, I believe it's Deuteronomy 20, that a Hebrew person who had just gotten married was excused from military duty. So it's not that these excuses were bad, but the host became angry. And what he said is, we are now doing the messianic banquet in a different way. I want you to go out and find all of the people who would never be in the inner circle, who would never be a part of the group that came to the banquet. I want you to go find the cripple, the blind, the lame. I want you to find everybody who feels that that person is an outsider. And I want you to invite them to the banquet. The servant says, we've invited them. Notice there's no distance. Once the host learns that these people that he's invited aren't coming, he immediately says, I want you to go invite this other group of people. And then the servant said, well, we've invited them and we still have more room. He says, I want you to go out basically to the highways and the byways of life and invite even more in until we have a full house. Now, when you and I read a parable, we want to ask ourselves the question, where is the jolt? Where is the surprise? Where is it that we are caught off guard in this parable? Where you and I are jolted in this parable is when the host says, I want you to invite all the people who would never be invited to a banquet, and we are going to have a banquet where the outsiders become the insiders. And then Jesus said, this is the banquet, the messianic banquet. The messianic banquet is not just for those who are in the right social group, in the right fraternity, in the right sorority, in the right segment of people. But the kingdom of God is about the jolting invitation to people who would never be invited to a banquet. I suppose what that says to you and me is not surprising. The host is not the first one to say this. The prophets in the Old Testament said the same thing. A prophet is not somebody who foretells the future. A prophet is somebody who captures the vision of the future and yanks it into the present. The prophetic word in the Old Testament was that everybody, even those who feel that they are completely outside any of the circles, are invited to the inner circle. There's something else about this parable that I think we learn. This parable is a message to churches that have a lot of people who are from the outside. You and I can go to some churches, and those churches spend a lot of time trying not just to go out to minister to people who never get into the church, but spend a lot of time saying what we are about as a church is not just to have people who socially are like us economically like us, religious like us, but you are invited to the banquet. I remember when I was pastor in First Baptist Church, DeLand, Florida, we had a place called the Duval Home. The Duval Home was a place where they had people who were physically and intellectually challenged. We decided that we would start a Sunday school class for these people. Now, we did it for a couple of reasons. We did it because we wanted these people. We were already going to the Duval Home to do Sunday school, but we wanted them in our church. Wheelchairs, all kinds, people who were lame, who were crippled. We wanted them in our church. And I tell you another reason why we wanted them in our church. Do you know the parents that often can't go to church? They're the parents of children who are like this, or have somebody who they have to stay home to care for. And we wanted to make it as easy as possible because we had something for the people that they were caring for so that they too could come to church. Now, I remember we had one woman in the church who objected. She wasn't a bad woman. She just didn't want her nice church messed up. You know, scratches on the wall, you know, the paint, we had to repaint. But, you know, finally, you know, after a little persuasion, particularly from her daughter, she came around and she became one of the biggest advocates for this. And every time I would walk into the sanctuary, these people were seated on the front. And they were the first people that I would see as I walked into the sanctuary. And I was reminded, the church is not just for the healthy, for the social, for people who are socially alike or economically alike. The church is for all of God's people. So it is a reminder to you and me that the church, the banquet, is not just for those who have 5 yoke of oxen, those who've bought new land, or those who've just gotten married. It's for people who are forgotten. Now let me go back for just a moment and put this in context so that you and I understand what is going on. Jesus is coming very near to what we call Jesus' passion. Jesus' death, Jesus' suffering. He's already done his last teaching in the synagogue. The rest of Luke is about Jesus, the picture we usually have of kind of the wandering, itinerant preacher who takes his disciples and who tells stories and who tells about different incidents in people's lives. Do you know how rich the rest of Luke's gospel is in terms of stories? Zacchaeus, wee little Zacchaeus, the rich ruler. That's in the last part of Luke before he gets to the Passion. Parables of people who have lost their way, but who are found by God. People who have lost something important to their lives. And do you know, when you and I come to the 15th chapter of Luke, the amazing thing is that every single one of them who finds the lost sheep, who finds the lost coin, who finds the lost son, all of them give a party. Folks, you and I can't read the Gospel of Luke if we're not able to go to a party. I know some people who say, you know, what we're about is so serious. Read the 15th chapter of Luke. Put on your party hat and go to the party. So many beautiful things in the last part of Luke's gospel. But we need to keep this in mind as we read Luke's gospel. Jesus knows precisely where he is going. He is going to suffer and to die and to give his life. That's why it's important. When Jesus tells the story of the Great Banquet, that suddenly what Jesus does, and Jimmy, I thought this was very interesting. I used to point my finger and then remembered Miss Taylor, my 5th grade teacher, who had that bony finger that she always stuck at us. And I decided that pointing fingers was not the right thing to do. That more of the open-handed, kind of the invitation. And this is the banquet now before Jesus' passion. Who is invited to the banquet? People who look like you and me. We turn down the invitation. Who is invited to the banquet? Jesus says, the people that you least expect are invited to the banquet. And throughout the rest of the gospel, this theme is carried through, so that when Jesus' passion occurs, you and I know that Jesus is not giving his life just for people who may see life as you and I may see it, but he's giving his life for the lame, the crippled, the blind. One of my favorite writers is a woman by the name of Annie Dillard. What she says in one of her writings is this. She says the agnostic asks the question, who turned on the lights? The person of faith asks, what are they turned on for? In other words, the parable operates not just turning on the lights and reading the story, but it drives you and me to a deeper level in our lives, where suddenly all of the barriers that we may sometimes erect among ourselves are broken down. And the table is open, and everybody is invited to the table. Everybody is invited to know the love of God and to receive the gift of Jesus' passion and resurrection. Everybody. Let's stop just a minute and